It was February 2022, 18 months ago or so, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And in terms of the political dynamic that's prevailing in the United States, it seems like that was an eternity ago. The support for that war was instantly generated and was overwhelming in both political parties. The establishment wings of both political parties, in fact, the entirety of the Democratic Party and the establishment wing of the Republican Party, united as they almost always do when there's a war, to urge that we must do everything to support Ukraine, handing it tons of money, giving it lots of our weapons to the point that we've depleted our own stockpiles. And the war propaganda was unlike anything I've ever seen before, and that includes the Iraq War. There was barely any dissent in the entire corporate media. They were all in favor of this war. There were a few outposts on Fox News, the leading one of whom, Tucker Carlson, ended up being fired and removed from the air, so he's not even there anymore. And the program that immediately followed Tucker in the 9 o'clock hour, Sean Hannity, was as fervently in support of this war as Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, and Nancy Pelosi. So from almost every direction, Americans were getting bombarded with very emotionally effective propaganda about the feisty Ukrainians and their noble battle for democracy and our obligation as Americans to stand up for them and to stand by them and help fend off this war of aggression from the Russians, because after all, we're Americans and that's what we do. And then you simultaneously had the fact that Americans had been feeding, especially Democrats, have been feeding an intense anti-Russian sentiment for at least going back to the Obama administration, when Hillary Clinton and others wanted to confront the Russians in Syria, wanted to arm Ukraine with lethal arms, but especially in the 2016 election, when the Russians and Putin and the Kremlin were blamed over and over and over again for the worst event in the psychological lives of American liberals, which is the 2016 defeat of Hillary Clinton by Donald Trump. So you can imagine how much they hate Russia. And then for years, they were fed stories from media outlets that gave themselves awards and Pulitzers for it, telling them falsely that Donald Trump was in bed with the Kremlin, that the Kremlin had blackmail control over Donald Trump, was controlling the levers of power in our country for their own benefit at the expense of American interest. So the anti-Russian sentiment among Democrats was so intense, and you have Republicans who just instinctively often support American wars, especially when the establishment wing and their leaders are behind it, as they were in this case. And there were very few people standing up in the media and saying that this is not a war that the United States should be feeding. We should be trying to stop this war, not spreading it, because of how dangerous it is and because it's not in our interest or the interest of American citizens to spend hundreds of billions of dollars without end trying to increase and spread what is an extremely dangerous war involving the world's largest nuclear power on one side, which is Russia, and then the United States on the other. And yet, because there were so few people in media who were saying it, and those of us who did were instantly accused of being Kremlin propagandists. I don't know how many formal lists I was put on by the Ukrainian government, but it was many, as was true of most people in politics or in media, Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard and Rand Paul and others who were in opposition to this war. So there was a lot of pressure on those who opposed the war, and there was a lot of propaganda convincing people to open up the treasury of the American government and just allow the spigot of money to flow uninterrupted. And I remember I had a friend early on, a very wise friend, who told me, don't ever back down from your position if you feel it strongly due to this pressure, because the history of American wars, and that will definitely be the case here, is that in a certain amount of time, whatever it is, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, Americans will ultimately be on your side. They will come to see that they have been manipulated into financing this war, even though it's not in their interest. And we are now at that time where a very comprehensive and reliable poll has demonstrated that a fairly sizable majority of Americans do not want to support or finance this war any longer. So here from CNN, which is the media outlet that sponsored this poll today, my guess is they were expecting a different outcome, but they got the one that they got, and they reported it from today. There you see the headline: majority of Americans oppose more U.S. aid for Ukraine in war with Russia. And here's what the article says, quote, Most Americans oppose Congress authorizing additional funding to support Ukraine in its war with Russia, according to a new CNN poll conducted by SSRS, as the public splits over whether the U.S. has already done enough to assist Ukraine. Overall, 55% say the U.S. Congress should not authorize additional funding to support Ukraine. Overall, 55% say the U.S. Congress should not authorize additional funding to support Ukraine, versus 45% who say Congress should authorize such funding. So that's 55-45, a majority of Americans who want nothing further to do with this war in terms of financing it. 51% of Americans say that the U.S. has already done enough to help Ukraine, while 48% says it should do more. A poll conducted in the early days of the Russian invasion in late February 22 found 62% who felt the U.S. should have been doing more. So an overwhelming majority at the beginning of the war who thought the U.S. should be doing even more than the Biden administration was already doing. Partisan divisions have widened since that poll too, with most Democrats and Republicans now on opposing sides of questions on the U.S. role in Ukraine. Republicans broadly say that Congress should not authorize new funding. 71% of Republicans say that. And that the U.S. has done enough to assist Ukraine, 59%. Among Democrats, most say the opposite. 62% favor additional funding and 61% say the U.S. should do more. Within both parties, these are splits along ideological lines. On providing additional funding, liberal Democrats are far and away the most supportive. 74% back it, compared with only 51% of moderate or conservative Democrats. That's the only reason why the poll is even this close, because 3 out of every 4 liberal Democrats in the United States wants to continue to fund the CIA-NATO war in Europe. Among Republicans, about 3/4 of conservatives oppose new funding, 76%, compared with 61% of moderate and liberal Republicans. So that is a pretty substantial partisan difference, where the Democrats want to fund the CIA war, proxy war in the Ukraine, which does not surprise me in the least, while Republicans are largely now opposed to it. Remember, Republicans nominated a president in 2016 who ran on a vow not to involve the United States in any more foreign wars and not to do any more regime change wars, and ran against not just the Democratic Party foreign policy, but the Bush-Cheney neocon foreign policy as well. And Republicans overwhelmingly elected him, despite establishment money overwhelmingly being behind his rivals such as Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. So the fact that the Republican Party membership no longer wants these intricate, endless commitments of U.S. funds and U.S. military strength to fueling foreign wars has been clear for some time, and it's very clear in this poll. But even with 3/4 of liberal Democrats wanting to fund the war even more, a majority of Americans now oppose it. Imagine time traveling back to 2005, and that was the year that I started writing about politics, and telling people this was the height of the growing opposition to the war on terror and the Iraq War. Imagine going back then and telling people in 15 years there's going to be a war that is the CIA's top priority. It's going to be against Russia. We're going to spend $100 billion or more, while we tell people they can't afford Medicaid and need Medicare cuts and all sorts of other cost of living problems. And it's going to be liberal Democrats who overwhelmingly want to fund this war and send more and more money to arms manufacturers and the arms industry and the CIA to keep this war going. And it will be Democrats who tell anybody who's against the war that they are traitors and disloyal to the United States and on the side of our enemies. Just imagine how crazy people would think you were if you were able to time travel back to 2005 and tell them, and yet 15 years later, that's exactly the reality in which we live. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.